At the end of the 1980s, two giants of Soviet politics, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, became the embodiment of a deep rift that led to the collapse of the USSR. The story of their confrontation, which ultimately changed the whole world, began not with enmity, but with trust. Gorbachev, already General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, saw Yeltsin as an energetic and active person capable of decisive action. In 1985, Gorbachev personally promoted Yeltsin to the post of head of the Moscow City Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was a time when Perestroika was just gaining momentum and the country needed fresh forces, those who could shake up the stagnant system. Yeltsin seemed the ideal candidate, a man of the people, straightforward, not afraid to speak his mind. He quickly gained popularity in Moscow by speaking out against corruption and privilege, forcing officials to ride public transport and shop alongside ordinary people. However, in October 1987, a turning point occurred at the plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin, contrary to the unwritten rules of party ethics, dared to voice criticism that was unprecedented at the time. He spoke about the slow pace of Perestroika, about the fact that it was stalling, and that the party elite, including, as many then understood, Gorbachev himself, continued to enjoy their privileges, unwilling to give them up. It was not just a voice of dissent, it was a direct challenge. In those years, such a statement, especially at such a high level, was tantamount to an explosion. For Gorbachev, who had initiated Perestroika himself but sought to carry it out under his control, gradually and cautiously, it was perceived as a personal betrayal and an attempt to undermine his authority. Yeltsin was publicly humiliated. He was sharply criticized, forced to repent, and then completely removed from all high positions. It was not just a transfer, it was a demonstrative reprisal designed to show what would happen to those who dared to go against the will of the General Secretary. This episode, like a thin but durable crack, divided their paths. It became a point of no return. Somewhere around this plenum, their personal acquaintance and cooperation turned into irreconcilable political rivalry. Yeltsin's ambitions for faster and more radical reforms clashed with Gorbachev's more cautious, party-oriented approach. One wanted to run forward without looking back. The other wanted to walk, holding tightly to the handrails so as not to fall. As personal resentment and ambition began to flare up, deeper ideological differences began to emerge. Despite all his reformist aspirations, Mikhail Gorbachev remained a man of the system, believing in the possibility of its renewal. He saw the future of the country as a renewed federation, a kind of Soviet Union that would retain its unity but become more democratic and flexible. He sought to gradually introduce elements of a market economy, but necessarily within the framework of the socialist system, without allowing its complete destruction. For him, it was important not only to change the country, but also to preserve its integrity and keep all 15 Union republics together. Boris Yeltsin, however, especially after he was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in 1990, and then the first president of Russia in 1991, moved in a completely different direction. His vision was much more radical. He advocated a decisive break with the old system and rapid, far-reaching market reforms that would completely transform the country's economic structure. But most importantly, Yeltsin increasingly championed the idea of greater sovereignty for Russia. In June 1990, Yeltsin initiated the adoption of the Declaration on the State Sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. This document was not just a formality. It was a direct challenge to the Union center headed by Gorbachev. The declaration affirmed the primacy of the laws of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic over Union laws within the Republic. This event highlighted a deep ideological divergence. Gorbachev wanted the system to evolve, to be transformed slowly and cautiously in order to avoid upheaval. He believed that the Soviet Union could be saved by making it better. Yeltsin, on the contrary, was increasingly inclined towards the idea of destroying the old system in order to build a new, independent Russia. He saw that the old mechanism was no longer working, and any attempts to fix it would only prolong the agony. These two paths were incompatible,
and the further they diverged, the deeper the rift between the two leaders became. As ideological contradictions grew, so did the struggle for legitimacy and power. In 1990, when it became clear that the old party mechanisms of governance were no longer working as effectively, Gorbachev took a bold step. He created a new position for himself, that of President of the Soviet Union. However, this position was not the result of a popular election. Gorbachev was elected to it by the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR. In this way, he attempted to centralize power in his own hands, hoping to maintain control over the crumbling empire. But the lack of a direct popular mandate made his position vulnerable. He was president, but his legitimacy came from the party elite, not from the general population. At the same time, Yeltsin, who had already tasted popular support after his speech at the plenum and his subsequent expulsion from the party leadership, actively used democratic mechanisms to strengthen his influence. He understood that in the context of growing distrust of the Communist Party and the central government, it was popular support that could become his mainstay.
This is exactly what happened in June 1991. Boris Yeltsin was elected the first popularly elected president of the Russian Federation. This event was a real triumph for him and a powerful blow to Gorbachev's position. Yeltsin received a direct mandate from the people, a legitimacy that could not be disputed. Millions of citizens voted for him, seeing him as a leader capable of leading the country out of crisis. This election significantly weakened Gorbachev's position. Now he, the president of the Soviet Union, elected by the party Congress, found himself overshadowed by the popularly elected president of one of the largest republics. Yeltsin's legitimacy was indisputable, while Gorbachev, although he held the highest office in the country, relied on party structures that were losing credibility and influence with each passing day. This not only deepened their personal confrontation, but also gave Yeltsin a powerful tool in the struggle for the future of the country. He could speak on behalf of the people, while Gorbachev increasingly looked like a representative of a bygone era. This moment heralded the coming changes, as power slowly but surely began to shift from the hands of the Union Center to those of the Russian Republic. The summer of 1991 was hot not only in terms of weather, but also in terms of political passions. Tensions between the Soviet center, led by Gorbachev, and the growing Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, led by Boris Yeltsin, reached a critical point. Gorbachev, as president of the Soviet Union, went on holiday to his state dacha in Foros on the Crimean coast. Perhaps he was hoping for a short respite before signing a new Union treaty, which, in his opinion, could save the renewed but still united Soviet Union. But instead of rest, isolation awaited him. On the night of 19 August 1991, while the country was still asleep, a group of high-ranking officials who disagreed with Gorbachev's policies and feared the collapse of the USSR formed the State Committee for the State of Emergency, or GKCHP. They declared a state of emergency and seized power. Gorbachev found himself under virtual house arrest, cut off from the outside world and deprived of all means of control. His telephone lines were cut off, his security guards were under the command of the coup leaders, and he could not contact anyone to oppose the conspirators. He was, in essence, a hostage to the situation, his voice unable to reach the people. At a time when the country was threatened with a return to the past, Boris Yeltsin proved himself to be a decisive and courageous leader. Upon learning of the coup, he did not flinch. Instead of hiding or submitting, he arrived at the building of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, known as the White House, in Moscow. Thousands of people had already gathered there, ready to defend democracy. It was then that the legendary scene that went down in history took place. Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank standing outside the White House and addressed the people with a fiery speech. His voice sounded confident and determined. He called the actions of the GKCHP an unconstitutional coup and called on citizens to disobey and resist. It was the moment when he took full responsibility, becoming a symbol of resistance and hope for many. Yeltsin's bold stance contrasted sharply with the perceived passivity of Gorbachev, who was locked up in Foros and unable to take action. This moment cemented Yeltsin's image as a strong, popular leader and finally pushed Gorbachev into the background. After the coup failed and Gorbachev returned to Moscow, his authority was undermined. He lost the trust of many who saw him as weak and unable to control the situation. Yeltsin, on the other hand, emerged from this situation as the winner, gaining unprecedented popular support and political weight. After the events of August, when the power of the Union center finally weakened and the republics began to declare their independence one after another, it became clear that the days of the Soviet Union were numbered. However, Mikhail Gorbachev tried until the very end to preserve at least some semblance of a federation by proposing a new Union treaty. But the flywheel of disintegration had already been set in motion, and it was impossible to stop it. In December 1991, events took place that put an end to the existence of the Soviet Union. On 7 December, Boris Yeltsin, as president of the Russian Federation, went to a meeting with the leaders of other republics. 3 key figures gathered in Belovezhskaya Pusha at the Vyskuly government residence in Belarus: Boris Yeltsin from Russia, Leonid Kravchuk from Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich from Belarus. These 3 republics were the founders of the Soviet Union in 1922, and it was they who had to make the historic decision. On 8 December 1991, they signed the Belovezhskaya Pusha Accords. These documents announced the dissolution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality. Instead, the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, was proclaimed as a new format for cooperation between the former Soviet republics. The most striking detail of this historic meeting was that Mikhail Gorbachev, who was still president of the USSR, was only informed of the decision after the documents had been signed. This was not just disregard, it was a final political knockout. Yeltsin and his associates deliberately made a decision that deprived Gorbachev of his post without consulting him. It was the culmination of a struggle between ambitions and ideologies. Yeltsin finally realized his vision of a sovereign Russia, putting an end to Gorbachev's project of a renewed union. For Gorbachev, this meant the loss of everything he had fought for in recent years, and the end of his political career at the top. The Soviet Union, which he had so eagerly sought to reform and preserve, ceased to exist. Beyond all the political and ideological differences that divided the country, there was a deep personal animosity between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. It entwined their relationship like poison ivy, turning every political decision into a personal insult and every public appearance into an arena for mutual jibes. Their confrontation was not only a struggle for power and the future of the country, but also a clash between 2 strong, charismatic personalities, each of whom considered himself right and unwilling to back down. Yeltsin, especially after his return to big-time politics and election as president of Russia, often publicly criticized Gorbachev. He did not mince his words, accusing him of slowness, indecision, and an inability to control the situation. These statements, broadcast on television and in the press, were not just political statements. They were aimed at undermining Gorbachev's authority and creating an image of an ineffective leader. Gorbachev, in turn, responded with contempt. He often ignored Yeltsin's attacks, and if he did comment, it was with the arrogance befitting a head of state who considers himself above petty squabbles. He could brush off Yeltsin's criticism like an annoying fly, emphasizing what he considered to be his short-sightedness or populism. Their feud did not end with the collapse of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's departure from the presidency. It continued for decades, like some kind of phantom syndrome of a bygone era. Even after their resignation, when neither of them held high government posts, they continued to exchange barbs through the media.